I'm live. I'll take 20 of that action. Are you live?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed
Now
the
what?
glitch.
There is no America.
What the fuck happened here?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
There is no America. There is no democracy.
Our fifth objective, a new world order.
There are no Russians. There are no Jews. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no
Vast
West.
right-wing conspiracy.
What do you call it when the assassins accuse the assassin?
A new world order.
Thank you for plugging in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch.
I'm your host, Professor Thomas Henry Horan.
He reads everything.
Maybe I should stop kissing the money. Maybe I should stop doing that. I'll just hold it up. Thank you very much. I'll have to let me boil some money and I'll just use that. I don't know how long this will go on. Hi, Brandy. Won't? Okay. Hi, John Toad. I don't know how long this will go on or how good it will be. I'm just trying to fill you in on where all this crap came from. His name is Emmanuel Swedenborg. I'm going to get right to the point. The app is working. I'm not even going to show you. See, there are two apps. There's the app you guys log into that's on Cloudflare. There's the app I use on the back end as administrator. I will show you later. I'm not going to waste time on that. I don't know how long this is going to be before I start coughing again. And I'm better today than I was yesterday. But apparently I caught a cold or something and got the flu shot at the same time. So, and it's been 188 degrees. I do have air conditioning. Don't kid yourselves. I can't even feel my toes. So, thanks, Brandy. I don't know how many more of these midnight episodes I'll be able to do. So, a lot of the premium episodes might be done in the mornings. Because it's just hard for me to stay awake this long. You kids. I can't keep up with you kids. Who the was Emmanuel Swedenborg, and what does he have to do with the murder of JonBenet? Now, is that the one thing I don't have up here? Let me just find Emmanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg was a genius. He was like the last of the really self-taught, real geniuses. Let me show you this guy. This may blind you. He was raised to be a mining engineer. We'll come back to that in a second. So his dad had a copy of Day Ray, Metallica, stuff like that. He was born in 1688. So this is right after this blossoming of the Royal Society, science becoming the really big difference between science and what had come before with alchemy and the occult and whatever was before this, the alchemists and those guys had hogged all of their secrets. Oh, Brandy, well, I'm going to hang in there extra long as I can, because I know you don't get to see a lot of... When's a good time for you, Brandy? You never get to see live. Swedenborg was born in Sweden. That's why his name is Swedenborg. I think the original name is Swedberg. But his family owned a mine, which was unusual because usually the kings owned all the mines. But his father's family had their own mining operation. They owned the mines, they owned their own mining operation. So he first went to Uppsala University to study theology. But he got in, this was, this explosion in scientific knowledge, because what they'd really done was, with the proceedings of the transactions or the proceedings, the Royal Society, before this, you had these alchemists and you had these Magikians, whatever you want to call them, these con artists. Some of them weren't con artists, but they would hog all their secrets, and you had to pay. And you might get ripped off. And you might get ripped off because he didn't really tell you the secret. You might get ripped off because he wasn't going to tell you the secret, or he didn't have a secret to tell you. And this really, really, really stagnates scientific and intellectual progress. Legendary places like Alexandria, once again, it's more open inquiry. And what the transactions really did was, during the plague years, Newton's peak Newton, everybody had to stay home. So the secretary of the society started letters would come in, people updating math, chemistry, whatever they were working on. He would make copies and mail them out to the other members. And I think somebody donated some money so they could get a printing press or use a printing press, so he could print these transactions of the Royal Society. And a lot of copies get printed, and they start getting distributed beyond even the membership of the society. So when the real innovation is, they're completely honest and forthcoming. This is kind of a hard and fast rule. No more secrets. These are the exact ingredients I used. These were the tools I used, and this was the method. I used this kind of thermometer and this temperature and all this other stuff. Making it open source allowed the scientific revolution to take place, the most recent scientific revolution to take place. Swedenborg is traveling all over Europe on his father's nickel, learning firsthand from some of the great scientists, and he kept a detailed diary. We know we don't know for sure. 1647. We don't know for sure if he met Isaac Newton, because while he spent 9 months in England, there's a gap in his diary. He learned everything. Swedenborg is the one who noticed that the brain tissues are different from the rest of the body. Microscopes had made microanatomy possible. The nerves and the circulatory system, respiratory system, they branch. They've definitely branched just like trees. Swedenborg noticed the brain doesn't really do that. There's kind of this structure that comes up, but the rest of the brain is, he didn't coin the phrase neuron, but he noticed this. And he noticed neurons always reaching out, even he's dissecting them from dead animals or whatever, reaching out and making new connections until they actually die. So he makes this discovery. But he got really interested in the discoveries of the astronomers, because they're beginning to prove that not only is the sun at the center and the planets orbit the sun, but that they are planets very, very, very similar to the Earth. Newton's law of universal gravitation, okay? Things on Earth obey the exact same laws as the things up there, so there doesn't seem to be a fifth element or a fifth law of physics. So that stuff up there must be right. And Newton is the first one to come up, really start to convincingly prove that meteorites are rocks from space and things like that, because he can prove that the planets are planets very similar to the Earth and obey the same physical laws. And I think it's definitely during Swedenborg's lifetime, the first astronomer who noticed and recorded closely Venus passed between the Earth and the sun. This doesn't happen very often, so we can see it. And I don't remember who it was. It doesn't matter right now. He noticed that Venus has an atmosphere. And the other planets, some of them look like they have atmospheres. Now we know Jupiter and Saturn are nothing but atmosphere. But so this theory pops up that these are not only possibly other Earths, these are possibly inhabited. Swedenborg is on fire with this idea. And he doesn't record his first dream or vision until he's 53 years old. But he's already renowned as a mining engineer and a scientist. And he comes out with this book. He comes out with a bunch of books. One of his most famous is The Heavenly Doctrine. Let me explain the impact he's had on your life. Let me start with this theology for a minute. If you believe in angels, you got that from Emmanuel Swedenborg. Emmanuel Swedenborg said angels were dead people whose souls had continued to grow and evolve and became angels. So if you believe that your grandmother's watching over you as your guardian angel, you got that from Swedenborg. If you got the idea that children who die, like JonBenet, went straight to heaven and became an angel, that's Emmanuel Swedenborg. If you believe all this angel crap that you see in the Christian craft stores and bookstores, I don't mean to call it crap, but it's all New Age, Christian New Age crap. It's all Swedenborg. That's all Swedenborg. If you go to a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, a Baptist, almost any Protestant church in America, if you're a Mormon, if you're Seventh-day Adventist, if you're Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't know what they call themselves. I think they call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't mean to put anybody down any more than anybody else. If you're anybody but Catholic, and even really if you're Catholic, your church, what you believe at your church, your core beliefs, that's Swedenborg. In everything you think you know about heaven and hell, that's Swedenborg. He wrote a book, Heaven and Hell. He said he had been to heaven and hell. So coming back to his cosmology, Swedenborg said he had been visited by an angel who used to live on another planet. And this ancient idea of, hi baby bull, this ancient idea of the seven heavens or whatever, that had kind of been thrown out by Galileo and Newton and these guys. But Swedenborg, one of the reason he got famous was he's able to keep this link between, Christian religion and science. They don't have to be enemies with Swedenborg. He incorporates all the latest scientific discoveries. So he notices that the brain seems to grow and develop its connections throughout life. So he says this process continues after death. You don't automatically become an angel, but you can become an angel, and you can start on that path in this life. But he didn't believe in reincarnation. But this angel that visited him said he was on his way back up to heaven. So you got the sun in the center, which is super hot, and Mercury, which is obviously pretty hot. Venus is not quite as hot, and then you get the Earth, which is the funnest place. And then you can ascend from there. This is all Emmanuel Swedenborg. Emmanuel Swedenborg invented the UFO. Emmanuel Swedenborg invented ancient aliens. If you believe anything of any of this stuff, this is all Emmanuel Swedenborg. Now, it comes down to us through lots of different paths because he excelled at so many fields of study and was charismatic and wrote he wrote. And I think he published some of his own books. Some were published after he died. Conversed with angels and demons and other spirits. The New Church, Restorationism, the first Great Revival, then the Second Great Revival, the burned over crap from upstate New York. This is all Swedenborgism. This is all Swedenborg-inspired Reformation of Protestant Christianity. Now, if you go to one of these churches, are you automatically being brainwashed into a cult? No. I'll explain this in a minute. There are the mainstream impacts of Swedenborg on science and religion, and then there are the esoteric ones. Then there are the, maybe they're fake. Hi, Gary. Amen, Gary. Half Catholic, half Sephardic Jew, crypto Jew. I know all about this stuff. Swedenborg was not, he conversed with demons, but didn't make deals with them. He's a very, if you think of Christianity as a happy, nice, friendly, overall optimistic religion, that's Emmanuel Swedenborg. But he was a kind of a Millerite. He believed the end of the world was coming. I don't want to split too many hairs on that tonight. This is a summary. He felt himself on the path to becoming a great scientist and wise man. But remember, he was a mining engineer, and a lot of mining and metallurgy was what he was famous for in the scientific circles. And then he becomes famous in the theological circles. Offered the chair of mathematics at Uppsala University. Turned it down. The pituitary gland, the perivascular spaces, the foramen of Magendie, somatotopic organization, and the first one to deliberately associate the frontal lobes with the intellect. This is Emmanuel Swedenborg. How matter relates to spirit. Actually, his writings on how matter relates to spirit has an awful lot, sounds very similar to Einstein's E equals mc squared, the relation of matter and energy. Not that he was, but he was that smart. He might have been the smartest person ever. Advances in smelting both iron and copper. If I'm not mistaken, Paul Revere's copper smelting, pirate copper smelting, industrial scale copper smelter was based on Swedenborg's book. How the soul is connected to the body. He thought the soul might be connected to materialism. He was an abolitionist. He was more of an egalitarian. He said all the races are equal. It's a competition in spiritual development by individuals. Any individual can do this. God became man so man could become God. That's Emmanuel Swedenborg. Celestial Arcana, blah, 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 blah. Then he wrote a book called Earths in the Universe. I think he really came up with the term universe, the way we think of it today. Swedenborg is informed by an angel that the other planets or Earths are inhabited by humans, all part of the great man. In Swedenborg's conception, each planet and its inhabitants represent some faculty or even organ of this great man. For example, the natives of Mercury represent memory. What follows is a tour of each of the then known planets as well as some from other star systems. Swedenborg himself claims to have accessed this information by traveling the spiritual world. I know what you're thinking. This sounds a hell of a lot like Theosophy, and you're absolutely right. The con artist, Helena Blavatsky, that's not her real name. What was her real name? I'll come back to that later. It doesn't matter, except her father was a Viking merchant. They were Baltic German. She was a con artist, but she really, he came up with the modern word Theosophy, although he would not have been a Blavatsky disciple. But what Blavatsky did was capitalize on the popularity of Swedenborg among the philosopher, the non-scientific, I don't mean non-scientific, but the he was famous as a scientist and a metallurgist, but there were people who really got into, and eventually he has this huge impact on Protestant Christianity. Not right away. I think it was more after he died. And he just wrote all these books. And this book, Earths in the Universe, the inhabitants of these planets are, by and large, all represented as non-materialistic, high-minded, and virtuous. They are mostly shown as living close to nature and away from centralized governments. Folkish. Those of Mercury are spiritual, those of Mars without hypocrisy, and those of Jupiter committed to education and children. These books were criticized. So they become the secret teachings of Swedenborg. So let's say you're a Mormon, or you're a Seventh-day Adventist, or you go to one of these Reformed Presbyterian churches, and somebody notices that you have an inquiring mind and a skeptical mind. You're asking all these questions, and you get into these discussions with these theologians, professors from the seminary. This doesn't happen in every church, but it can happen. And they reveal to you that all this stuff all goes back to this guy named Emmanuel Swedenborg. Then, if Swedenborg claimed to be he was a vegetarian, or some people thought he was a vegetarian, but he did eat eels and pigeon pie. Eels are a very popular food in the North Atlantic regions. The point is, this whole idea, in turn, will inspire a lot of the early rocket pioneers. We can actually build. It became known through the balloon ascensionists that the atmosphere thins out very quickly, and we can't just take a balloon to the moon. So we have to have another way of getting to the moon. Airplane won't work, a balloon won't work. So eventually they come up with this idea of the rocket. The rocket can go to other planets. Was he a Rosicrucian? He read all the Rosicrucian books in his travels. The Rosicrucians knew more about metallurgy and alchemy than anybody. He may have, we don't really know, but he studied all of that stuff. All of it. I will come back to that in more detail. For now, here's the thing. So let's say you're one of these Christian groups and they notice that you're ambitious and narcissistic. So they introduce you to Swedenborg. And then they say, well, Swedenborg created revealed theosophy, and here are all these other books on theosophy. Are you with me? So you might be someone, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a scientist. You can go to one of these churches, and if you fit the right profile, if you're a potential Jim Jones, if you are a potential Charles Manson, if you are a potential William Branham, if you are a potential Billy Graham, if you are a potential Adolf Hitler, they'll reveal to you that Emmanuel Swedenborg, basically behind this Reformation in this church, and then they reveal to you that he was this genius and all this other stuff, and then they get around to theosophy. Then they get around to this idea, which has already been talked about in your church, that man became God so that God became man so that man can become God. This is where you get into, they tip over into this. Are you with me? Not for everybody, only for the elite. Hillary Clinton, for example, I'm sure. Now, they will say, oh, no, not theosophy like Helena, like if you turn up your nose at it, they'll say, oh, no, he was before them. Yeah, she was a con artist. She ripped off some people. But, they'll bring up Annie Besant. You like they'll say, you like Gandhi, right? You appreciate Gandhi, right? On the other hand, if you were a young aspiring rocket scientist The only magazines that would publish articles by these rocket experimenters were the science fiction magazines, like Astounding Science Fiction, Amazing Stories. These magazines that published occult stories, ghost stories, they published all the rocket research. And so they start publishing this stuff, about colonies on Mars and visitations by aliens. This goes back to Swedenborg. And so if you are one of those young scientists and then you're interested in this stuff, they say, oh yeah, there's probably aliens. There's this great scientist and great religious prophet or whatever. And he started theosophy. Then they introduce you to theosophy. But not every rocket scientist. But Edward Lansdale's Roswell UFO hoax, right back to Swedenborg. Eric von Daniken and Ancient Astronauts, Swedenborg. Not that Swedenborg specifically said the pyramids were built by aliens, are you with me? But he introduces this idea. And he has all this respect as a scientific writer, an engineer, a metallurgist, and a Christian theologian. You never heard his name, but you live in his world. If you believe in any kind of intelligent life in the universe, that's as much Emmanuel Swedenborg as anybody. If you believe in angels, that's Emmanuel Swedenborg. Now, once again, Blavatsky was able to exploit this for money. But she dug up a lot of old books, and she had fans who did, McGregor Mathers, people who caught on to her being a con artist, but they got interested in the stuff. McGregor Mathers, obviously, Crowley, Aleister Crowley, and others. Israel Regardie. He was the charismatic con artist who turned a lot of people onto this stuff. Now, why does this matter? She's from the Ukraine. They are very superstitious people. Before Rasputin, there was another guy. And before that guy, the attempt was Crowley himself to try to become the Tsarina whisperer. To manipulate her, because everybody knew she manipulated her husband, who never learned how to be czar. So there's this, everybody and their dog is trying to feed a guru to the Tsarina. Well, you get these, people forget, there were Ukrainian and Polish and Russian geniuses too, the Teutons, perhaps, and some Jews. And they become some of the early great rocket pioneers. As a matter of fact, let me see. Do I have this one open? Open a new tab. Is this the one? Yes. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of modern astronautics. A philosophical movement known as Russian Cosmism. His mentor in Moscow, Nikolai Fedorov, taught a bizarre, visionary philosophy that combined Eastern Orthodox Christian resurrection themes, the wandering bishops, with cosmic engineering. Peter Levender will tell you that God became man so that man can become God. Fedorov argued that humanity's moral duty was to physically resurrect all dead ancestors, and that to make room for them, humanity had to colonize the cosmos. Now, he inspires a bunch of young kids to build rockets. The Will of the Universe and the Cosmic Philosophy, these books, The Will of the Universe, the Cosmic Philosophy. The universe was packed with conscious higher intelligence, and that humanity's destiny was to evolve into space-dwelling gods. So, he's probably inspired by Swedenborg. He probably finds confirmation in Swedenborg. And again, this stuff gets published in the science fiction pulp magazines. Now, the mathematician who did the actual calculations for what kind of thrust it would take to get to the moon, for example, and how much fuel. Of course, the higher the rocket goes, the less it weighs. The guy who did those calculations and predicted that liquid fuel could get the job done was Hermann Oberth. Now, Hermann Oberth came to the United States as well. And there's this teenager from Saxony, very close to Transylvania. Between Hermann Oberth and the Russian cosmists and the Swedenborgians and all of this stuff, and who's reading these books and who gets the idea to try to build a liquid-fueled rocket, is named Werner Magnus Maximilian, a Freiherr von Braun. He's inspired by all of this, and he decides he wants to build a rocket. I think he wants to go to Mars, and I think later he wants to go to the moon. He built a rocket that went to the moon, but he didn't get to ride in it. Imagine what that was like, to watch that rocket take off and watch those TV cameras and watch those guys land on the moon. But he's immersed in both of these. Do not let him fool you. There's Willy Ley, one of the founders of the Rocket Association. So they're more occulty. There's William Ley. I'll come back to these in more detail. Max Valier, a key VFR founder, was obsessed with space travel as moral and evolutionary imperative for humanity. Was killed in an early rocket explosion. One of his rockets blew up on him. So you get this stuff, and these guys are looking, what did the Rosicrucians know? And they hear about Swedenborg and all of this stuff, and some of them get sucked into theosophy, and some of them get sucked into this stuff. Now, it gets to be, let me summarize this. After World War I, and the Versailles Treaty had limited Germany's weapons development very severely. Oh, Arthur C. Clarke, sure. I'm sure that Carl Sagan was a little bit inspired. I don't know if he believed that he had met aliens, but well, John Toad, Jack Parsons, who I'll get to, maybe not tonight. Jack Parsons specialized in solid fuel rockets. That was the contract Aerojet had with the Air Force. So, Jules Verne? Oh, I'm sure. Oh, British Israelism. A lot of this, like they corrupt, Swedenborg wouldn't be into that, but they corrupt a lot of this stuff. Now, the Mormons will come into this too. I'm going to stick to the rocket scientists just for tonight. Right. He didn't call them Ascended Masters, Brandy, but the idea of the Ascended Masters comes from Swedenborg. Swedenborg himself was not an evil guy, but once you get this ball rolling, and he has this impact. So that's why all these different people, this is the thing they have in common. They have Emmanuel Swedenborg in common one way or the other. Now, he wrote another book I'm going to talk about real soon. A book you've never heard of, but you believe everything in it. You've heard of it, but you never heard the title of the book. So here's the dealio. He may have played with it. Well, we'll come back to Parsons later. He's important for sure. So the dealio is this. Under the Treaty of Versailles, General Dornberger, I think his name is Dornberger. Let me look up his name. I had this, but I don't know. Let me just ask again. He said rockets were not specifically prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. So he got money. Is his name Dornberger? What was his name? Walter Dornberger. Walter Dornberger, artillery officer. He was an artillery officer. I'll come back to these guys. Dornberger was an artillery officer. Maybe I'll just come back to that later. Grady McManus was an artillery officer. Dornberger, Grady McManus. I got that somewhere else. We'll come back to that when we come back to American Rosicrucianism and OTO and the Golden Dawn and all that crap. He figured out this. So they had the money. They eventually, and he hires Werner von Braun because he saw a demonstration by Werner von Braun of a liquid-fueled rocket that was actually going to work. So he hires von Braun, a very young guy, and von Braun assembles his team. Now, von Braun and a lot of his guys believe in a lot of this crap. I'll get more detail later. But for now, what you need to know is when they build their testing facility, their big research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, Heinrich Himmler worms his way in with his SD and his Gestapo or whatever to conduct a security to keep Peenemünde secret and secure because the army doesn't have the resources. This is around 36, 37. Now, Heinrich Himmler happens to be a big believer in this thing that was bigger than crystals, and it was called the World Ice Theory. And it was super popular all around the world. Okay, this is Hans Horbiger. Hans Horbiger. From Austria. Whoops. This guy. He invented, speaking of metallurgy and mining, he invented a new kind of flapper valve for blast furnaces that really is a huge step forward. So he gets rich and he gets famous for this. And the high-pressure chemistry that is necessary for liquid-fueled rockets. Are you with me? This is Hans Horbiger. Hans Horbiger. I'm sick of these German names. No offense. Had an office in Budapest and then moved back to Vienna. His son was named Attila. Let me translate. He wrote a book, Wirbelstürme, Wetterstürze, Hagelkatastrophen und Marskanal Verdoppelungen. Translate this. This has to be translated. Translate. Vortex storms, sudden weather changes, hail catastrophes, and Martian canal duplications. You think this podcast is great? This guy would have been the king of YouTube. He would have been the king of YouTube. He said that the universe was fundamentally ice crystals that in space existed in special configurations. And it was the smashing together of all this ice that created the stars, When an ice ball falls into a sun, it causes all this stuff. He was hugely popular. Hugely popular. Hugely popular. Theories were popularized by people like this is Hans Schindler Bellamy, an English professor living in Austria. After the Anschluss, returned to Britain. He monitored German radio broadcasts for the BBC. Died 1982 in Israel. They were, he and his wife were Orthodox Jews. He finished the book by Rudolf Elmire von Westenbrugg. Delivered a lecture at the Second World Congress of Ancient Astronaut Society in Zurich. Okay, this is Hans Schindler Bellamy. So it's not every rocket scientist. You didn't have to join the OTO or the Golden Dawn in order to work on the rocket program. But an awful lot of these guys did. And an awful lot of these guys were paperclipped to the United States and, of course, to the Soviet Union. We got most of the big stars. There are two in particular I'm going to mention. Walter Thiel was killed in the raid on Peenemünde. But Arthur Rudolph was the project manager. He was in charge of producing the rockets. That is Arthur Rudolph. He was in charge of the slave labor. He was in charge of everything. He was the guy who got the rockets built. He was so important that after he was paperclipped, he was in charge of getting the Saturn V rockets built. I bring that up because Rocketdyne developed the F1 engine. Rocketdyne was a rival to Aerojet. They never merged. Rocketdyne was a rival to Aerojet. When Aerojet was pretty much disbanded after Parsons' death, an awful lot of his engineers went to work at Rocketdyne. I'll show you a map in a second. I will show it to you right now. Rudolph, everybody blames Speer for using slave labor to build the V-2 rockets. This started under Rudolph. Rudolph was put in charge of building the Saturn V. And the guy, NASA's chief of space medicine, Ernst Stirlinger, was the guy who performed not like Mengele performed worthless experiments or he duplicated old experiments. He was a crank. He was a quack. But Stirlinger is the one who did the human experiments on low oxygen concentration, low, high altitude, low pressure, and hypothermia type of studies. So they made him the head of NASA's space medicine program. So when you put your life in, when you volunteered to become the spam in the can, the guy who you put your life in his spicy hands was Ernst Stirlinger. And Herman Oberth was paperclipped. Now, what does this have to do with Manson? Let me show you. Let me show you this. I had somewhere, maybe it's worth doing. I feel a little better tonight. Let me keep going. But Himmler was really into this crap. And he's the one, there was a time when Werner von Braun was actually arrested and held in jail for a few days. He was accused of wasting government resources trying to fly to Mars instead of winning the war. And Himmler apparently put him up to it. This is where Himmler brought Swedenborgism directly into the Nazi V-2 rocket program. That was Himmler and his cronies. And There's no record of Werner von Braun ever not getting along with Heinrich Himmler, for what it's worth. Is this... Let me look here. I want to find these addresses. Oh, I have a video to show you. If I live, I have a video to show you. Okay. One of these... There it is. Hold on. Why can't I find crap on this page? Oh, okay, hold on. Actually, this is what I'm looking for. The actual address of the Yellow Submarine House. Oh, let me... Okay, that must have been... $21,019 Gresham Street. It's not there anymore, but the address is terribly important. I think it's Canoga Park. There it is. Yep, right there. I'm going to show you in just a second. And then... Remember that phony kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr.? $8143 Mason Avenue. There we go. Can you see that? This right here, maybe I should zoom in. I'm trying not to monkey around with this stuff too much because we all know what happens. Okay. Can you see my cursor? To the somewhat upper left here, this red dot, that was the location of the Yellow Submarine House. This down here, this is where Frank Sinatra Jr. was supposedly held captive. Do you see this yellow blob? That's Rocketdyne. That is the facility where the F1 rocket motor for the Saturn V booster was designed and built. Right there. And if we zoom out just a little bit, here's Chatsworth, here's Santa Susana, here's the Santa Susana testing grounds. And right down here somewhere is Spawn Ranch. Try it like this. Spawn Movie Ranch. Oh, here's Spawn Movie Ranch way up here. This is where they are testing. They didn't test the F1 out here. What they were, by 1968-69, the F1 has been tested and proven. It's in production. By 1969, what they're working on and testing out at Santa Susana is the liquid hydrogen boosters that the Soviets never got the hang of. And with commies like Catherine Scher deeply embedded in the Manson family, let me tell you what one of the things they were doing out there. One of the things they were doing living across the street, they lived a block and a half from Rocketdyne facilities in Canoga Park, and then they moved just a little ways further west. No, not from 8143 Mason. It doesn't matter. They move a couple miles out to Spawn Ranch, so they can keep an eye on the development of that rocket. How many trucks did you see go in and out of the factory? How big were the trucks? What did they have in the names stenciled on the side? Did you hear any noises? How loud was it? How long did it go on? Any information they could get from the Manson family. Well, a lot of the information they wanted to get, they could get from the Manson family. Now, that's not the main point. It's just one of the little points. One of the many little points. Here's where it gets important. Give me a minute. This takes a minute. There's something else that's very important. There's the guys who go to work at Lockheed. But see, a lot of them start at Aerojet, and then they get jobs at Lockheed. They get jobs at Rocketdyne. The J2 liquid hydrogen engine, that's the one. Stuhlinger is the one who came up with ion propulsion. Yeah, Oberth wrote the book, The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. Had the whole theory worked out, exactly how much energy it would take, blah, 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 blah. Hans Kellner was key in Himmler getting full control over the V2 rocket program. And of course, Himmler got the authority to do all the vetting and the background checks of all the people who worked on the V2 rocket program. This is how you infiltrate your own people. The Verein-Raumschifffahrt. The Rocket Association. Well, here's the thing. It's coming to me now. The list of names. Swedenborg was primarily famous for being a mining engineer. Just like Guy Ballard or Guy Ballard or Guy Ballard. I am, and all of that crap. He was a mining engineer, just like Savannah Guthrie's dad, Charles Guthrie. And Annie's poetry, which we will read some in a members-only episode soon, sounds exactly like something Guy Ballard would write, for whatever that's worth. We'll come back to that. But the funny thing is, and I've been over this, right before the Ramseys, the Steins, the Fernies, and all these people moved to Boulder in 93, 91, 92, this is when this case of the Ballard and Dunnan families breaks. And Ballard had gone from one secret Lockheed facility to another. The Ballard who got busted, he had the TV show, and then he got busted, lived right there in the middle of the skunk works. No direct relation to Guy Ballard. However, there are Ballards from Ballard, Utah, where the Duquesne airfield becomes the hub of the Duquesne spy ring, which drags in Sam Carr, his wife Frances, and his sister Julia. They're also counterintelligence corps. They're responsible for security at the facilities that are developing the Norden bomb site. And the computerized Norden bomb site used to drop the atomic bombs was tested at that Duquesne airfield. Duquesne had something to do, Duquesne base or something, out there in the Uinta Valley. This is where Sam Walton is counterintelligence corps, working base security. At one time, he's guarding German prisoners of war. I only bring it up because Adolf Hitler guarded some Russian prisoners of war after World War I was over. Those two things together. James Ramsey, JonBenet Ramsey's father, was not a combat bomber pilot. I have this somewhere. He was a transport pilot. He was a ferry pilot. He grew up in Omaha. That's the Boeing plant where they built B-29s, but specifically at that time, by the time he got his pilot's license, they were building silverplate B-29s. And if he flew them to Duquesne, it's not called Ballard, it's not called Duquesne. There's an airfield out there. He would have had regular contact in that area. And Michael Ballard and the Dunnans, Ballard and his wife and the Dunnans were the ones who ran that really, really horrific child abuse ring. Identical to the injuries that were inflicted on JonBenet, and some injuries that were even more extensive and worse. And this went on for years. They get busted around 92. Not one of the paying customers. They were arrested, tried, and convicted for trafficking their children to paying customers, and not one of the paying customers was ever arrested or charged with anything. They were still living in Boulder when the Ramseys, the Fernies, and the Steins, and the rest, and the Whites all moved to Boulder. Well, that Access graphic terminals processing those images coming down from those satellites, the keyhole satellites, that was a Lockheed project. Lockheed built the keyhole satellites and the Hubble. The Hubble Space Telescope was the extra one. They didn't need it, so then they made the adjustments to the mirror so they could point it out in space. But that was its secondary purpose. That was a Lockheed company. Michael Ballard moved from one Lockheed town to another. And those Ballards from Ballard, Utah, they were a mining family. Well, thank you, Brandy. Medley. Is that Medley? There's a weird highlight color suddenly. Thank you, Medley. Well, those Ballards and Guy Ballard both had a joint, they were both in mining, and they both had a joint project at Mount Shasta, where the Lemurians live, and where Jim Phillips Crabtree and Darlene Suennen spent their honeymoon. So what? Darlene supposedly tore her ACL on that ski trip, and the doctor who supposedly, that picture of, I'm just summarizing this stuff, that picture of Jim and Darlene, Jim with the unknown, or Darlene with the unknown man, that's apparently Jim's brother. And the house where that picture was taken, Jim said that was the house. Jim said, I'm the one who took the picture. He said that house belonged to the orthopedic surgeon who fixed Darlene's knee. Maybe he lived there, maybe he didn't, but it was owned by a paperclip Nazi named Horst Heinz Eifler. And she worked at the IHOP pancake house that was owned by a Hitler Youth kid, grew up, and his father had been a machinist engineer in both American and German aerospace before, during, and after World War II. Does that give you some idea of where we are going? This is how it's all tied together. There's a common thread, and that common thread goes back to Emmanuel Swedenborg. And he wrote another book I will tell you about next time, or sometime soon. That book was called, it's the very first book that could be called Western sex magic. But he didn't write it that way. But they get a lot of their ideas from this. And that book was called Conjugal Love. I'm Professor Thomas Henry Horan, asking you to please stay plugged in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
He reads everything.
He reads everything and he catches everything. Thank you so much. Mwah. Put that one wherever you want it, and I will see you probably Wednesday.